Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about Weimar Germany. That's the Germany that started after the end of World War I in 1918 and went through until 1933. So now there are quite a few commentators around that not only in Europe, but in the United States and even here in Australia, that draw parallels between what's happening today in the Western world and the globalization imposition and so on, and what happened in Europe and particularly Germany during that time, 1918 to 1933. Now, I suppose you can always draw some parallels with periods in history and compare them to today, but I don't know how useful or reliable these parallels may or may not be. There clearly are some similarities. The instability of our times and the instability of those times is just one example. But let's go through what happened in Weimar Germany and of course explore these alleged or possible parallels. Can we learn from history? What can we learn from history? Or is the famous dictum, what we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history? Does that apply here as it does so often in other things? So let's have a look at that. Now, at the end of World War I, the German government collapsed. The Kaiser, the king, the emperor, abdicated and fled to Holland. And the government, as it was, pretty much there was a military government really at the time, and the senior generals were really running a lot of the show, and civilian government was kind of there just to back them up. But when military victory was no longer possible, the military government effectively abandoned their governmental positions and handed it back to the civilians. The civilians were then required to make a very hasty peace, and part of that peace involved the change in really the structure of government. So it wasn't kind of imposed directly, but it was imposed to a large extent. So when the new constitution was drawn up, which was drawn up very quickly and very hastily by, I suppose you'd call them moderates, I guess, but they met in the town of Weimar, which is why the constitution was referred to as the Weimar Constitution or the Weimar Republic. So now there was nothing organic about this. The German people hadn't chosen to do this. It hadn't developed, as say the British model did, over centuries of trial and error, 2 steps forward, 1 step back type evolution, organic evolution. There's nothing like that. There was no constitution, nothing like bang, suddenly it was there. And it was, again, very hastily put together at the end of 1918. And I don't know if anyone really saw it as a permanent fixture, but rather something, just a device to be able to give some form of legitimacy to a government who could then sign a peace treaty. That really was the backdrop to it. So, but in terms of that sort of period in the life of the German nation type thing, there was nobody who wanted that constitution or who wanted that arrangement. There was not a single supporter. There was not one champion of that constitution or that structure of government. And it showed that right across the political spectrum, everyone was plotting and scheming to either get rid of it or modify it so comprehensively that it looked nothing or would look nothing like it had started out. So on the left, we've got the socialists who want to have a democratic socialism, but they wanted to nationalise all farmland, for example. Now, most of the farmland was in larger estates that were owned by what you could say would be the aristocratic class, or even the petit bourgeoisie, if you like. that terrified them. So the socialists lost really their support, and a lot of the upper echelons of the administration and those sorts of things were those sort of guys in that. As we're called, the Junkers, Junkers, and other words, the aristocratic landholders. So you would call them maybe squires in England. They wanted that. Now, going further out to the left, if you like, was the communists who were proposing radical armed revolution, and nearly all the people at the apex of that were Jews, including Rosa Luxemburg, a lesbian Jewish school teacher, and in her writing, she was quite forthright that any opposition to the communist revolution should be put down with great brutality. In effect, anyone that disagrees or got in the way should be killed, and which is how Marxist Jewish is that, and a lesbian to boot. And her confederate Karl Liebknecht was pretty much the same. So they wanted armed communist revolution, and they wanted to usher in this workers' paradise, much along the lines of how Lenin and Trotsky had gone about things in the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia. So, and there were other players also out on the left who wanted various or different combinations, if you like, of socialism and radical communism and so on. Then on the other, this is before the Nazi Party didn't exist at this point, but then on the other side there were groups that wanted to bring back the emperor, for example, or bring back really the German state under Prussian hegemony, and again splinter groups sort of all across that spectrum. The folks in the middle, the moderates, I guess you'd call them, also didn't really want the constitution. They believed that they had to do two things: get the German people to accept that there was a new form of government and a new type of democracy in town, and they figured this would take 25 to 30 years just to get the Germans to accept, the German people, the voters, to accept that this was a new standard, if you like. But even then, they really wanted to amend it very substantially away from what it was. They didn't see it as functional or a long-term viable project. So they wanted to use the constitution that was hastily put together as sort of an embryonic starting point, a first draft that they would amend and modify to the point where it would have been unrecognizable 20 odd years down the track. So those were the players, and it was mayhem. The communists in particular hired or had membership that had lots of goon squads, thugs, hoods, hoodlums on the street, intimidating public officials, beating up magistrates, forcing electoral officers to miscount votes to make sure communist deputies got elected, and so on. So, and this, of course, as you can imagine, concerned a lot of Germans. None of the other parties really could effectively fight back against this, and the communists kind of ruled the streets, and vast intimidation across swathes of Germany. The army, what was left of it, was called in to put down some of the most violent communist insurrections, and there were a few, and many hundreds of people were shot in street battles with the army and the kind of paramilitary police. But really, it was the late 20s in particular before any political party appeared on the scene that could command a substantial majority. When I say, as in become the largest party by far, and that was the NSDAP. So that was the National Socialist Deutschland, Germany, Arbeiter Workers Party, so NSDAP. This later was abbreviated to Nazi, but at the time it was called the NSDAP. And they had their own goon squads on the street fighting the communists. And this was viewed positively by many Germans because the communists had had years of really free run. But the Nazis had their own goon squads, and they used to have these running battles, across streets and suburbs, and brass knuckles and knives and the whole business. Sometimes it would degenerate into a shootout. Sometimes the police or the army would jump in and find everyone was shooting each other, and no one knew who was on what side. It was a complete mayhem. So this was the state of Weimar Germany. It had the constitution, and the whole Weimar Germany itself had not a single supporter. Nobody wanted it. Again, it hadn't arrived organically. It hadn't arrived with the agreement of the German people. It just had appeared and was, if you like, imposed upon them without their consent. So as the 1920s wore on, certainly into the 1930s, if you want to create, the governments were rising and falling, and there were coalitions that were getting together and then would start arguing and would fall apart. There were 2, sometimes 3 elections in a year, and it was just chaos. And good governance, of course, was suffering. Now, the intriguing was also when you get that level of instability and chaos, people naturally gravitate towards intrigue and drama. It seems to have a gravitational pull once chaos descends, and certainly it was definitely chaotic. So instead of sort of dealing with the issues and trying to create stability, the main political players, von Schleicher and von Papen and Brüning and those guys, among others, they put all their time into intriguing and trying to neutralise each other. And they increasingly, governments were operating by decree and by executive order and without reference to the Parliament or the Reichstag. So this just added to the mayhem, but also added Weimar Republic and the government, the politicians simply weren't legitimate. And when a government policy or a constitution or things are imposed on the people without their consent or without sort of organically developing over centuries and that sort of thing, it lacks legitimacy, and people won't support it, and neither did the politicians in Weimar Germany. They believed that it lacked legitimacy, and they believed that the other guy in the other political party lacked legitimacy. So it was crazy. And there were people sort of openly advocating for the arrest of political opponents they didn't like. The minister president of Prussia, which had been divided off from Germany by a corridor of Polish land in the Versailles Treaty. He wanted to arrest Hitler. People might say, well, that would have been a good thing. I mean, he knew that Hitler was a Nazi and a fascist, and no, it wasn't that. It was nothing to do with that at all. Hitler looked like the most prominent contender to take power because he was head of the largest political party in Germany. So that's why the guy wanted to arrest him, just to neutralise a political opponent. And this was sort of how it was. And this was sort of how the Russia collapsed into the Bolshevik Revolution. You had all the political parties were sending out their own police force to arrest each other, and that was crazy and a reflection of the mayhem of those days in Russia's case, 1917. So this is how it was in Germany, and you have to imagine this chaos. Now you've got a president who's part of the old sort of Prussian military tradition. In fact, had been really the head of the military government of Germany that was in probably mid 1917 to the end of 1918, and he was the German president, and had executive various executive powers, but in order to calm things down because they were going to spiral completely out of control, in order to calm things down, the president, under advice, by the way, from various politicians, von Papen among them, said, well, look, we've got to get some stability into the situation here. These guys have the largest political party in Germany, though they're recording the most votes. They've got the most deputies in the parliament. So really, if we're going to create anything stable, we've got to do it with these guys, which is fair enough. I mean, anybody would think that. They didn't like Hitler, not because they thought he was a bad guy or a good guy or anything like that. It's because he was working class, or at best lower middle class, and he'd been a corporal in the army. He'd never been an aristocrat, and politics was viewed as an aristocrat's game, occupation. And he was this kind of working class guy with working class manners, by the way. And they thought, okay, we'll put him in. We'll put his party in. They kind of had to give him the chancellor's job, the prime minister's job, but he was surrounded by I think it was the senior 11 ministries in the government, and the Nazis only held 2, which is Hitler and Goering as minister for Prussia. The other ministers were all von Papen's flunky boys, many of which had been approved by Hindenburg, the president. So they figured they had Hitler all bottled up, and he couldn't look sideways without getting their permission. And but events moved beyond that, and as we all know, Hitler consolidated power for the NSDAP. So, but this idea that there was some sort of everybody wanted the Weimar Constitutional Republic, and that dastardly Hitler sort of took it away from those poor innocent Germans. I mean, that's crap, absolute crap. It was about as dysfunctional a situation as you could possibly get. The Nazis were the biggest political party in voted for by the majority of the German population. Not an absolute majority, but as in the biggest party. And bear in mind, there were a gazillion parties all competing and splintering the vote off in all directions. So coalitions, which is why they didn't last, coalitions could often be of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 parties cobbling together a majority, because you had to have a 53% majority to form a government. So, the Nazis with about 44% or so of the vote, and then von Papen's political party with about 9% of the vote, they managed to fall over the line of the 53%, and they formed government. And again, Hitler. They thought they could control Hitler, and they thought, he's just some working class boy. He'll do what the fuck he's told. And it wasn't the fact Hitler had won the Iron Cross for bravery, the German army's highest award for bravery. If he hadn't won that in World War I, he wouldn't have even have been, no one would have even looked sideways at him. He was this working class guy who with that the rough vulgarity of someone who's come from that class, and here he's mixing with all these very well-mannered, heel-clicking patricians, and they looked down on him. They thought he was just a bum, but he had this Iron Cross for bravery, so he kind of had some cred, and that at least allowed him to get into doors he otherwise wouldn't have had a chance of getting into. So that's the thing about Weimar. Now, does it have parallels with today? Now, I suppose in a way it does. Really, in terms of the Western world, we've had a constitution, a new constitution, forced upon us by the globalists. The globalists have used our own politicians, our own media. They've infiltrated and controlled both, and so they forced this on us without our consent. Mass migration into the West. It's all over the West, and clearly centrally coordinated and scripted and directed and controlled. I'm not aware of any country that's voted. Where is the referendum from any country? It's like, do you want to be overrun with black and brown, peasants of illiterate peasants of different religions? Without, do you want to? Would you agree to this? Do you want to? It would get absolutely hammered in the polls. And so they can't have a referendum on that. What about having a referendum? How about we quadruple the price of gas and electricity so you can save the planet like Greta Thunberg says, then that would get hammered. No, that's not going to get anywhere. That won't. No one's going to vote for that, or the people who can afford to do it, or the kids, the marijuana smoking kids living in their folks' basement would, but no one else is going to. And if you look at all of the globalist initiatives, none of them would pass a vote or a referendum. They had to be imposed and forced. And given the control of the media and the way the state is now increasingly and very openly bypassing the rule of law, bypassing due legal process, stacking the courts with activists, stacking all the public service with activists, and operating outside of any restraint, and the people have less and less input. If you dare question what they're doing, then you're called a Nazi and racist and all sorts of names. So effectively, we've had a new constitution imposed upon us, and that's certainly creating a great deal of mayhem. It's not easy for the globalists to keep it together. In spite of their control of the media and all the bodies politic in the Western world, they still can't get it. They can only go forward with the globalist project by crushing all dissent and just ignoring the democratic process, which they're proving themselves rather adept at doing. So, while at the same time saying they're trying to protect democracy. I mean, what a load of fucking bullshit, the chutzpah of it. So there is some similarities if you look at it from a wider sort of angle. We've had a new constitution all across the Western world imposed upon us without our consent. We've had the globalist project imposed upon us without our consent, without our agreement, without even fucking any consultation, for goodness sakes. So in that sense, I see possible parallels there, and also I see that, or I believe at least, that has created chaos. It's put things that we took for granted, put things into play. We counted on a free and honest, independent media. That's gone. We counted on independent, apolitical courts. That's gone. That's it's now ideological. We counted on an independent police force that would prosecute, that would arrest criminals, and that's gone. The police now are more concerned with arresting you for not wearing a mask, or arresting you for using the wrong pronoun for a transgender, whatever, and they're being used as ideological political police now, not as police to protect the citizenry or arrest criminals. They're doing that as sort of an accidental byproduct of all the ideological and political policing they're doing. So there's been, with all these things gone, these are the bulwarks of society, and one by one the globalists are kicking them out of the way because it gives them more power. But on the backhand, it means it creates a degree of chaos and mayhem and a complete loss of confidence in all institutions, which creates the if you like, the social and the lack of cohesion and the liquidity, the mercury sort of going all over the place. It causes a whole lot of things to start unraveling and turn into multiple cans of worms. And I see that as a parallel with Weimar Germany. The issue is what will replace it. Now the globalists have trashed what worked well and that we all respected and agreed and that had developed organically over centuries. They've kicked all that away because it's not convenient to them, but they haven't replaced those values that were deep-seated in society. They've kicked them away, but not replaced it with anything. And whatever they've got, they can't sell because it's such crap. So I see parallels in that sense, that now we're waiting for the Elon Musks and the Donald Trumps of the world to get up and sort it out for us. And it should never have got to this stage. A functioning, confident democracy shouldn't have to rely on a multi-gazillionaire, billionaire guy to come along and save it. It shouldn't have come to this, but it has, and we have to realistically accept that's where it is now. And the globalists have got us here, and the mayhem they've imposed on us hopefully there'll be consequences for them just as much as it will be for the rest of us as we try and pick up the pieces and put it all back together again. You've been with Tassos today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.